Put it on there. This is our 17th lesson. We're in chapter 6 of my flood book, the second edition of my book, and of course it hasn't been printed yet. So you're looking at the book. I've been sending it to you. I tweak it there a little bit, add some more material to it. Hopefully when we finish the class, I'll have finished the book. So any questions about last week's class? I want to point out one thing. I caught a little error that I had. I made the point that use of the isotope with 18 particles in the nucleus for oxygen, 8018, what I did is I said that they were dating it by that. That's not correct. They weren't dating it by it. They were determining the temperature of the water by that. That's what they were using that for. Okay. Any questions or comments? I did say that later, but you might have got the impression they were both dating it. I just said something, and when I realized I said it later after I listened to it, I said, no, I'm going to correct that. All right. Noah, let's look at Noah. He was a righteous man, and these are the generations, Genesis 6:9 of Noah. Noah was a righteous man and perfect in his generations, and all walked with God. Well, I'll tell you what, if someone could say about you, you were righteous, you were perfect in your generation, you walked with God, I don't know much more good that they could say about you, okay? He was indeed a very good man. He was a great man. Of course, he's grandfather to all of us, of course, many greats, of course. So I lay that foundation to lay another important point here as we get into it. Genesis 7:1 speaks of him again. And Jehovah, the Lord, said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Again, God speaks of him this way as being a righteous man. So he was very righteous. He was indeed a good man, okay? Ezekiel speaks of him and uses three great men as examples of people who were righteous. And though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, so he lists three great men, and he says, were in it, that's the city, I believe, of Jerusalem, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord Jehovah. So right here, they would only deliver themselves by their righteousness. Again, he's telling us Noah was a righteous man, along with Daniel and Job. Verse 20, skip down, he says, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord Jehovah, they should deliver neither son nor daughter, but they should deliver their own souls by their righteousness. So this tells me something else. This tells me also not only was he righteous, but probably his sons were righteous, his children were. But whatever the case here, Noah was a great and a righteous, a good and a godly man. Now, with that being said, we get a problem here. Let's look at the word righteous. Sadiq is the Hebrew word, and Hebrew reads from right to left, so Sadiq. And Brown Driver Briggs Gesenius Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon says it's just or righteous in conduct and character, right, correct, lawful. Again, that's a whole lot of good stuff to say about a person. And that's Strong's number 6662. This word is also translated righteous or just or righteous. They're basically the same word. In English, they're even basically have the same meaning. All right. Noah lived by the standard of God's will as revealed to him. And so he was a righteous man. Again, this was a great man. Are there questions or comments? I'm leading up to something here, so kind of be with me. All right. These are the generations of Noah. Genesis 6:9, Noah was a righteous man and perfect, Samim, in his generation. Noah walked with God. So not only was righteous, but he was perfect or complete, say, blameless in this passage, or perfect. So he had nothing could be said about him. No blame could be placed upon him. I would argue he's a great and a good man again. This word here, samim, is perfect or complete, whole or entire, and sound, innocent, healthy, having integrity. Man, you can't say a whole lot more about this man other than he's just a great and a good man. Now, let's go to Genesis 9:20 and see something. Here's this man that the Bible only says good things about him. What happened here in this verse, Genesis 9:20? And Noah began to be a husbandman and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. Now, here's a problem. Here's a man that the Bible speaks of him glowingly of being a great and a good man, but he gets drunk. Now, let me ask you a question. Suppose we think about this. He either intentionally got drunk, knowing if he drank this wine, it would make him drunken, or he did not intentionally drink it, knowing he would get drunken. Would everyone agree with that? That has to be the case. There's only two possibilities. Either he knew it would make him drunken, or he didn't know. If he knew, then why did he get drunken? Why did a good and a godly and a great man do this? If he didn't know, is it possible that he didn't know it? That he was unaware, that he was innocent in this matter, and that he just didn't know that this was going to happen? Any questions? First of all, does everyone seeing the screen before I get too far into the class?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So I'm claiming that I don't think Noah knew about alcoholic wine prior to the flood. Any questions or comments about that? We're going to show some things that I think would lend to that conclusion. All right. The flood model set forth in this study explains how Noah accidentally became drunken. A man who's glowingly spoken of in the scriptures. Nothing is ever bad said about him, except this one event. All right. Now, suppose he accidentally got drunken, had never seen alcohol before, alcoholic wine, and he drank it, not realizing that it would make him drunken. Would he be sinning if it was an accident? I would think probably not. But if he repeated it later, then that's a different matter. But if he didn't realize that it would cause trouble with him, then I don't think he's necessarily sinned in this matter. That's my conclusion. Right? And I hear preachers assume that he got drunk on purpose. And that's totally out of character with what the Bible says about him. Now then, can we explain, or is there scientific reason to think that alcohol would not be formed in the pre-flood environment, the antediluvian environment? And I believe the answer to that is yes. We're going to show that tonight. So I really think some people have accused Noah of being a drunkard, and I've heard sermons on that. People write about it, and I think they're just off base. I think they're wrong. Because again, the Bible doesn't even hint of this. And later, now Ezekiel wrote about him later. And Ezekiel was in the time of the Babylonian captivity. And he wrote about him about roughly 500 BC. So I would say this is totally out of character with how he's depicted in other passages of Scripture. Are there questions or comments so far? You just have to wait and see if I make a good case for my argument to prove my point. All right. It's also possible that yeast would not ferment in the antediluvian atmosphere. So we'll have to talk about how fermentation occurs and how this happens and what caused it to happen. Okay. Now, when O2, that's normal oxygen molecule, oxygen normally two atoms cluster together in one molecule. That enters a cell that is degrading glucose, that's basically sugar, anaerobically. Now, that's a big fancy word without oxygen, okay? The rate of glycolysis, and that's the liberating of energy, or you liberate energy, biological energy, is called glycolysis. I haven't had any organic chemistry, all right? I've just had to read it out of chemistry books, okay? I haven't had a course in it. But this Wolf is a organic chemistry book. And that's where I got this from the college library where I was a professor. When O2 enters a cell degrading glucose anaerobically, the rate of glycolysis decreases rapidly. This response is called the Pasteur effect, or it's also called the Pasteur point, P-O-I-N-T. And so we have the Pasteur effect. Now, Louis Pasteur, the winemakers in France commissioned him, paid him to do research on wine making. And he found a very interesting situation. And we're going to get to it. It's called the Pasteur effect, or Louis Pasteur, like pasteurizing milk, right? So this is the yeast that produces alcohol can operate aerobically or anaerobically. Aerobically is it's using oxygen to assimilate the glucose. If it's anaerobic, it doesn't have any oxygen, so it has to get its oxygen from somewhere else. So it pulls it out of the water, H2O, and what's left is alcohol. So that's how alcohol is formed. And it's when the yeast is operating anaerobically without oxygen, right? So he experimented with wine and grape juice, basically fermenting, and he did a lot of experiment. He made it aerobic, he kept it oxygenated, and it didn't make alcohol. And so he found a very interesting arrangement. What it would do is it would make some different chemicals rather than alcohol. It didn't make alcohol. It made what we call vinegar. Okay. All right. Any questions? Now, the Pasteur point, or the Pasteur effect, or the Pasteur reaction, you see it in all three different ways named, is a point at which cells turn from fermentation to respiration might be reached by yeast in the antediluvian atmosphere. If so, yeast would not ferment. See, if it was not reached, say, and if it was not functioning anaerobically, the yeast would not ferment grape juice. And Noah would not have known about alcoholic beverages. Remember, Pasteur discovered this effect while conducting research in winemaking. That's where he discovered it. So, under these conditions, antediluvian conditions, one would not produce intoxicating beverages. Now, the Bible does speak about them eating and drinking and marrying, but it's not accusing them of necessarily of sin and drunkenness. And so it's talking about their normal events when it speaks of the pre-flood people and the flood coming upon them. So under these probable conditions, and my claim is this, that it will not ferment if we keep oxygen in the wine, in the grape juice, and we keep oxygen in it until all the glucose is used up in the sugar. And when that occurs, there's nothing else to ferment. Can't happen anymore. And that would produce vinegar. Okay. And so we produce red wine vinegar, that's called. You can buy it at the store. I put it on my food a lot of times. And I've used a lot of vinegar. And I like the taste of it. So you wouldn't produce intoxicating beverages. Now, what would it take for this to not be able to go and become anaerobic? What would it take? What kind of an atmosphere would accomplish this? That's what we want to ask ourselves. It clearly explains, if this were the case, why Noah became drunken, because if it was something he had never seen before, it would be perfectly an accident. We don't have any passage that even hints that he did this again. And nowhere does it hint that he did it. And nowhere does the Bible explicitly call him a drunkard. A drunkard is one who repeatedly does it. What if someone put some LSD in something you were drinking, like a Coke or a cup of coffee? You didn't know about it. You got high on LSD. I don't think you'd be sinning. I think people who put it in your drink would be sinning. I don't think you'd be sinning. You'd still have you go on a trip, a psychedelic trip with LSD. But again, people do give other people drugs when they don't even realize they're eating it or drinking it in a drink or in food. It happens. And of course, it's an evil thing to do that to somebody, but there are evil people out there that do it. And so I don't think if someone put something in my drink or in my food that made me lose control of myself, I don't think I'd necessarily be responsible for what I did. Again, that's my view of God's justice. Okay. Any questions? Noah had not experienced any fermentation prior to the flood, and hence was ignorant of it. That's my claim. All right, we're gonna show why this would be the case from my postulated antediluvian atmosphere. Okay. The pasture effect could also explain why certain diseases occur that could kill large numbers of humans. Now, some bacteria is not harmful to you until it becomes anaerobic. And when it produces alcohol, it becomes anaerobic and produces alcohol, we have a problem. That's when it becomes a problem. So what we have here is some of your bacteria might not even be harmful at all to you. That bacteria that kills you right now, that is in the pre-flood antediluvian atmosphere. Microorganisms which cause disease in post-diluvian world, many of them probably function differently in the antediluvian world. And so the very organisms that God created, when the situation changed in our atmosphere, these organisms began to produce poisons that they put into our system. Alcohol is a poison. And so if bacteria becomes anaerobic, it starts producing alcohol, and which can be toxic to your system. Too much alcohol can kill you. And so it's entirely possible that some of these very bacteria that we worry about so much, streptococcus and so forth, strep and staph, that these only are problems because when they become anaerobic. Right? In the antediluvian world, these organisms did not cause disease, but in the post-diluvian world, they produced disease. Again, this would partially explain the decrease in longevity of the post-diluvian men. The antediluvian men lived 1,000 years or close to it. And the post-diluvian, their longevity started going down right after the flood. And so there's a big change in the longevity of man after the flood. Any questions? All right. Now, Berkner and Marshall on page 244 talk about unicellular green algae involving normal photosynthesis. All right, can be adapted in a few hours to photoreduction in a hydrogen and under special circumstances, a nitrogen atmosphere. So if the atmosphere changes, then these algae can actually begin to assimilate food in a different way. Photosynthesis to photoreduction. And so there's a reduction, a nitrogen atmosphere involving direct reduction of CO2, carbon dioxide from atmospheric reductants. So here, all kinds of microscopic plants change how they operate in an atmosphere that is different than the post-diluvian world. It's different than the antediluvian. So if the atmosphere changes, it can change a lot of organisms, how they operate. Any questions? All right. So this is going to be a big factor in explaining the decrease in longevity. I believe Noah lived, I think it was 950 years. I think it was. It might have been 960, but I think it's 950. And I know Methuselah lived 969 years. And I believe those were literal years. And I believe this partially or good, to a large extent, explains that difference. Right? That is the atmospheric changes. Photosynthesis is the synthesis of chemical compounds with the aid of radiant energy, and especially light, also the formation of carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and the source of nitrogen as water, hydrogen as water, in the chlorophyll containing tissues of plants exposed to light. So that's what this is, a photosynthesis is. And that's what makes green plants, and it makes chlorophyll. So it takes in light, it takes in carbon dioxide, it takes up water. And all of those together make the plants grow. Okay? But they can change, if the atmosphere changes, they can change. Photoreduction is chemical reduction under influence of radiant energy. So again, they begin to operate differently if the atmosphere, if the amount of various gases in the atmosphere change. So when they change things, conditions change. And if it's a permanent change, you have a permanent change in conditions. And so I would consider and argue that conditions changed and it was a permanent change after the flood. Any questions or comments? A reductant is a reducing agent. Now, I'm not going to get into the chemistry of it. Right? It's not our purpose to do that. If you've had chemistry, you can study this more thoroughly. If you haven't had it, go to a community college somewhere and take it, okay? And get you all enrolled in a community college, take a chemistry course or two. It would help you understand some of this, okay? It's possible that some organisms that now kill or cause illness in mankind were actually beneficial to mankind in the antediluvian environment. And the changes in the atmosphere change one process, such as photosynthesis, to another process, photoreduction. And if this is true and the atmosphere is permanently changed, we would have a permanent problem with these processes operating differently than they had before. Any questions or comments? Things would not go back to the antediluvian arrangement. Baker's yeast, the yeast that they use in baking, has a completely different growth process under post-diluvian atmospheric conditions or present conditions than it would have under the reduced nitrogen conditions that we see. And remember, the nitrogen was a problem under reduced nitrogen conditions. Now, right now, 78% of our atmosphere roughly is nitrogen, 21% is oxygen. Now, I have theorized, and there's scientific evidence from measurements they've made in Amber and other places, that the atmosphere in the past had 35 to maybe as high as 39% oxygen in it, which would mean you'd have a reduced reduced amount of nitrogen. So the nitrogen would be reduced by virtue of being more oxygen. That would make these plants function in a different way. Let's go back now. Remember, this was an arrangement where we had a change in the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Right here, Berkner and Marshall speak of this special circumstances, nitrogen atmosphere. More nitrogen in the atmosphere, see? So when the nitrogen increases, it changes the conditions. All right? Now, Baker's yeast replicate, when they replicate, Hoffman tells us, page 1510, usually when yeast replicate, the daughter cell buds off from the parent and eventually forms an independent cell. So we have independent cells being formed by what we see in nature right now. That is our conditions that we see in the present atmosphere. That's what he's talking about. But in a reduced nitrogen medium, which we would have before the flood, the daughter cell remains attached to the tip of the mother. They don't break off. Then a new cell buds from that daughter's tip and so forth until it forms a filamentous. That's like a filament, or a whole bunch of cells all attached together like we'd see in a branch, like on a tree branch, and so forth until it forms a filamentous chain of connected yeast cells, thread-like, like a thread, long threads. So again, the yeast functions differently. Any questions? And all that makes it change and will function differently is a different amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So again, the postulated nitrogen in the atmosphere we're measured right now 78% and 21% oxygen, about 1% roughly of other gases. And so now if we bump it up to 35% oxygen, we'd have to, the nitrogen would come down by the amount the oxygen went up, unless we had other gases involved, which was only about 1% anyhow. So I'm claiming that we had a reduced nitrogen atmosphere in the antediluvian atmosphere. And so we know the Baker's yeast would actually function differently in that arrangement. It would form a filament, thread-like parts, rather than forming separate cells. Majority, let's look at how it would affect. Now again, our atmosphere, increased oxygen, reduced nitrogen. Majority of aquatic invertebrates lack well-developed respiratory and ventilatory systems and depend upon diffusion mediated respiration. Now, what does that mean? Here's what happens. Some animals do not have lungs. Now, how do they breathe? There are a few fish that have lungs, but most fish don't have lungs. And so what we have is they breathe through their gills. Most people think, well, that's true, but most fish also breathe through their skin. And that's diffusion. They breathe through their fins and their skin. And so they breathe in a different way. They take in oxygen a different way. And what we have here is the majority of aquatic invertebrates, that's like clams and stuff like that, lack well-developed respiratory and circulatory systems and depend upon diffusion-mediated respiration. So they actually get oxygen out of the water that passes through their cell walls in their either gills or in their skin or their fins. That's what happens. He says here, increased oxygen of Devonian carboniferous freshwaters. So he's going back into the atheist time, back in the times before the flood, that they call the Devonian carboniferous freshwaters, would have increased their utility as nursery grounds. Now, what's that mean? He said there was more oxygen in the atmosphere, and there was an increased barometric pressure. And what this would do, and we'll show the laws of science to prove this would have increased the amount of oxygen in the water, all right? And so the oxygen and Devonian carboniferous freshwater would have increased their utility as nursery grounds. In other words, the babies would have been able to breathe easier for eggs and larvae, thereby expanding life history options from the rapidly diversifying terrestrial arthropods. Again, they're postulating organic macroevolution, but what the point I'm making here is this, that these animals that breathe through diffusion, through their gills or through their fins, or a combination of both, these animals would be able to breathe easier, and they could multiply better, and they would have better ability to feed themselves, and they wouldn't even have to have as much food to survive, because they don't have to spend as much energy to breathe and to have their circulation. So again, if you're more efficient, you don't have to eat as much, because your body doesn't need as much energy because it's easier to breathe, or easier to take in the oxygen in this case. Questions or comments? Beyond the global atmospheric hyperoxygen. Now that's a big fancy word. Hyper is from the Greek hyper, which means above. Oxic is oxygen, so we would have a greater amount of oxygen in the water, in the atmosphere, and also in the water. It would have reduced the limitation of seasonal aquatic hypoxia. And so hypo or hupo, this would be hupo in Greek, that would be under or less than. So under oxygen, you don't have as much as normal. Now what happens? Let me explain this. Sometimes here in Oklahoma, when we get it real hot for a few days, we'll have fish dying in lakes. Well, why do they die? Some people think there's poison in the water. That's probably not the case in most instances. Of course, poison does get in the water. But what we have most of the time is that added temperature makes the water, oxygen come out of the water. When the water gets warmer, oxygen comes out of it. Gases that are in the water come out. You can put a pan of water on a stove and start warming it up, and you'll see bubbles coming out of it. This is the gas coming out, and there's basically a laws of physics that tells you how much gas can be in the water of any gas that will diffuse in the water, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide. How much can be in the water at a given temperature. Now, if it gets colder, it can hold more oxygen. That's why, see, so it means a seasonal aquatic. So that has to do with the seasons. In the wintertime, there's actually more oxygen in the water than there is in the summer for the fish. And of course, when the barometric pressure goes up, there'll be more oxygen in the water and also more carbon dioxide for the plants to eat, to operate on. And so favored interfaunal penetration of marine sediments. So again, these animals can penetrate deeper into the sediments as well as to live better in the water itself, allow denser aggregations and increase body size of some groups. The body size of an animal that breathes by diffusion is dependent upon the amount of oxygen it can get into its body. And if the amount of oxygen available is only a certain amount, if the animal tries to grow too large, he'll die. And so this is a problem, and that would change the size of some animals, particularly aquatic animals, and animals that breathe by diffusion, and all your insects breathe by diffusion. And we'll see this later as we develop it. Questions or comments so far? All right. Beyond the global atmospheric hyperoxia, and so that's more oxygen, we would have reduced the limitation of seasonal aquatic hypoxia. All right. And so we could have increased body size and increased aggregations or more of these animals. Ventilatory is relating to ventilation. And of course, hyperoxia is elevated oxygen. Hypoxia is lowered oxygen levels. An increased oxygen level in the atmosphere and an increased barometric pressure postulated by the flood model would increase both the size and the number of marine organisms. You'd have more of them and you'd have bigger ones. You could have larger ones. Are there questions? We see that in the fossil record, okay? A model of the Earth's carbon cycle. Now, the carbon cycle, carbon dioxide is breathed out by animals, and the plants take carbon into them and put it in their stems. And then they release O2 for the animals to breathe. God made us depend not only on the plants for food, but also for the air we breathe. Model of the Earth's carbon cycle over the past 570 million years, again, they take the old Earth view, of course, suggests that compared to its present value, the partial pressure of CO2, carbon dioxide, may have been an order of magnitude higher. Now, what's an order of magnitude? That's a term that's used by mathematicians and people in science and engineering. An order of magnitude is 10 times. 2 orders of magnitude is 100 times. 3 orders of magnitude is 1,000 times. That's all that means. May have been an order of magnitude. That means it's 10 times higher in the early Paleozoic and about 4 to 6 times higher in the middle Mesozoic. And when he said order of magnitude, he actually goes in and gives it as 16 times higher, but 1 order of magnitude would be 10 times. So he means around an order of magnitude, well, 16 times in the context of this discussion. So if the what we call partial pressure, and I probably need to get in to explain that next week, and I'll try to do that next week, partial pressure. But the partial pressure has to do with the barometric pressure and the kind of solution it is and the temperature. These are factors. So I want to deal with that, the partial pressure, okay? That gets into a little bit of physics, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can, okay? Now, any questions? Now, these are scientists that are all, basically probably all atheists, that are making the claims of what the antediluvian or the in the past, what the pressure, barometric pressure and all was in those time periods, the time periods that we would say are antediluvian. This would provide both larger numbers of animals and also plants, and more kinds of organisms be fossilized by the flood. Bigger number, larger size, and diversity, more diversity. Okay. Questions? The growth of marine life would be enhanced by a higher level of both oxygen for the animals and carbon dioxide for the plants, and the increased barometric pressure that we have. Okay. All of these would be factors. Let's get a basic law of physics, and also it's a law of chemistry as well. It's called Henry's law. The solubility of a gas in a given liquid. Now, we're looking at water. What's the solubility of a gas? Well, let's look at the solubility of 2 main gases that we're interested in. This is oxygen and carbon dioxide. The solubility of a gas, let's say oxygen in a given liquid, is considered to be a specific property of the gas because of its solubility differs from that of other gases in the same liquid. So the amount of oxygen that would go into water would be different than the amount of oxygen that would go into gasoline, for example, because they have a different specific property that would tell how much could go into it at a given temperature and pressure, barometric pressure. So what he says here, and we're only concerned with water. Now, how would that affect us? Well, your blood is mostly water. And so the solubility of water would basically tell you the solubility of your blood to carry both oxygen and carbon dioxide. It differs from that of other gases in the same liquid. All right, so the solubility of carbon dioxide and solubility of oxygen will be different than each other, is what he's telling you. For example, at 0 degrees, that would be Celsius, and at 760 millimeters, that's your normal barometric pressure, 1 liter, that's a little over a quart of water, dissolves 0.0489 liters of oxygen. All right. The solubility of a gas and liquid can be increased by increasing the pressure on the gas. So if you increase the barometric pressure, then there'll be more oxygen in the water in this case. Now, I don't fish very much. I used to fish some, but I'm just not into it very much. But I think your barometric pressure can affect how the fishing goes. And so if you have an increased barometer, your fish can be more active because they get more oxygen in their water. At a lower barometric pressure, it's harder for them to breathe. Right? So the solubility of a gas and a liquid can be increased by increasing the pressure on the gas. Increase the pressure, you get more into the water. Now, you can see this with a carbonated soft drink. If it's warmed up a little bit, just room temperature, and you take the cap off, it may spew out. The carbon dioxide that's in the drink will come out. It may come out and spew out of the top of the soft drink can or whatever it might be, or bottle or can that you're drinking out of. Any questions? This relationship is qualitatively expressed in quantity. That's a mathematical relationship expressed by Henry's law. The weight of a gas that dissolves in a definite volume of liquid is directly proportional to the pressure on the gas. You double the pressure, you double the gas. That's what they mean by directly proportional. You triple the pressure, you'll triple the gas. This means, he goes on and explains, this is Nebergall, this is a basic chemistry book, that this means that if 1 gram of a gas dissolves in 1 liter of water at 1 atmosphere of pressure, 760 millimeters, 5 grams will dissolve at 5 atmospheres of pressure. That's this basic chemistry is directly proportional. If you had 10 atmospheres, you'd have 10 grams in it. Does that make sense? 3 atmospheres, you'd have 3 grams in it. It's directly proportional. All the questions so far? This added oxygen dissolved in the oceans would have enhanced the growth of marine and aquatic animals in the antediluvian marine and aquatic environments. Marine would be in the ocean, aquatic would be like in lakes and streams. Okay. In addition, the added carbon dioxide, because the added barometric pressure would put more carbon dioxide in the water as well, would have enhanced the growth of marine plants because they take in the carbon dioxide. Both of those would have worked together, helping all kinds of marine life, both plants and animals. Probably some species of life were made extinct by the reduced oxygen and carbon dioxide levels of the oceans. There probably were some that just had a harder time living and they just died out because of it. And so we lost them. And again, that would be that change in the atmosphere. Any questions? Henry's law is also affected by the temperature of the liquid. As for in our discussion, we're talking about water. That's what's important to us. The water where marine animals and aquatic animals live, and the water in our blood. All of these are factors for us because our blood through the lungs takes in oxygen, gives off carbon dioxide, and can give it off at a higher rate. With a higher temperature, the liquid will retain less gas. So when the temperature goes up, the more of the gas comes out of it. Now, people get worried about when someone gets a fever. I think it's foolish unless the temperature is so high it's damaging to the brain, maybe. It gets too high, but I think you ought to leave a fever alone because that's God's way of fighting disease. That's your body's way of fighting it. God made us that way. And what I'm saying is, when my temperature goes up, it allows my body to get rid of more of the carbon dioxide that's in my blood. It also makes it a little bit harder to take in oxygen, but it also gets rid of the carbon dioxide, and it may get rid of some other problems for us. We just don't know enough about it. God made my body that way, and I just don't fight off a fever unless it gets real high. I'll leave it alone, let it run its course, because I think it's helpful to your body. I think your body is made to. I believe God made our bodies to fight off disease as much as possible. But when the temperature gets higher, the liquid will retain less gas. So my breathing will get rid of the carbon dioxide better, because that warmer blood, if I've got a temperature of 1 or 2 degrees, it's 1 or 2 degrees warmer than normal. And normal body temperature for most people is 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. All right? But if it goes up a degree or two, probably not going to hurt your body. Don't knock the fever down. Let the fever help fight off the disease. Some germs, some bacteria, and other things like viruses cannot survive in a warmer environment. They don't like it to get too hot. And so it makes it harder for them to grow. Right? A lower temperature, the liquid will retain more gas. So this is why we have fish die-offs in lakes in the summertime, because the temperature goes up and the oxygen comes out of the water. And you may even have plankton die off because there's a carbon dioxide come out of the water when it gets too hot. So they can't live either. And so we worry about all that stuff, but it may be just as simple as that. And so the lower temperature, the liquid will retain more gases. Now, I would ask you a question. Where is the commercial fishing best? Is it best off the Gulf of Florida, in the Gulf of Mexico, or is it best off the Grand Banks up around Labrador and Newfoundland and up north of Maine where the water's cold? Up and around Grand Banks, that's where it's better, because there's more oxygen in the water for the fish to breathe. So the fish can get larger and there can be more of them to be harvested. So when the temperature goes up during the summer, the fish may die from the lowered oxygen levels in the water. The plankton and other plants may die as well. When the temperature goes down during the winter in the cold climate regions, the number and size of the fish is higher. Of course, the fish do have to have something to eat. So if they're eating insects and other stuff and it gets too cold, the insects are not around. So again, there's other factors involved. It's why fishing in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific oceans is quite good. Some of your sea creatures, like crab, get larger in those regions because they breathe by diffusion or by their gills, and so they can take more oxygen in and get rid of the carbon dioxide better due to that change in that temperature, colder waters. The greater density of the atmosphere would have made it easier for flying animals to fly. The lift on their wings would have been greater because of the greater air density. So it would make it easier for birds to fly. Now, keep that in mind. In addition, the greater density would have provided extra protection from meteorites that would be more likely to burn up in the denser atmosphere. So again, meteorites wouldn't come in and be as damaging to us because the thicker atmosphere would burn them up. They'd be burned up more quicker. Here's some birds, fossil birds. These are birds, they found fossils of them in Antarctica just a few years ago. And here's a fossil bird that has a wingspan of 21 feet. This is a fossil albatross. If you know about albatrosses, those things fly, and they'll fly for weeks, maybe even months, and never land. And they have just tremendously large wings. They'll just soar and go along. And so these things dip down, eat fish, but these are 21 feet wingspan birds, fossil birds. Okay. this, and here's the name of it. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. Pelagornidus, and this is the name of this fossil bird. Now you can look this name up and find a lot of information about it on the internet. Okay? And here's two links to these birds, and you can have these two links. Now, the Smithsonian magazine. There are other magazines, there are one or two other magazines, but I couldn't access them without paying for it. And I'm not interested in going any further on it. I'm just saying there were birds with 21% feet wingspan. Now, that's pretty big. The biggest wingspan we have right now, a living bird, is an albatross. This is a fossil albatross. What it is, it's an earlier albatross. But a 21 feet wingspan is a pretty big bird, for crying out loud. It's an awfully large bird. There also were birds that they claim were dinosaurs. They claim they were reptiles, but they're not sure. Petrosaurs apparently had wingspans of 9 meters, according to several sources. That would be of 29.5 feet. That's even bigger. And so there were some of those. Picture of a fossil one, and I'm not sure it's got that 29 or 39 meter wingspan, but that's pretty large. Let's go back now. That's nearly 30 feet across the wingspan. That's a pretty big bird, pretty big flying creature. They're not even sure. Of course, they begin with atheistic premises that evolution occurred, and these birds started out as soaring birds. That is, they just glided from one tree to one source to another and crawled up the tree and then glided again. and of course, they're doing this and claiming it was evolution. And a few of them were able to flap their wings and they began to fly. But of course, that's their evolutionary views that they started with, the premises, which I don't know that they can establish. I want you to think about here now, and this is important for us. We have given evidence in prior lessons that even the atheists claim the barometric pressure was higher and the amount of oxygen was higher. In other words, I don't have to prove that anymore because the atheists have already agreed to it. So if that's true, what we're saying here would occur. And I would argue that yeast would not ferment, and so Noah would not have known about fermentation prior to the flood. I think Noah found out about fermentation, and the kind of man that Noah was, he didn't get drunk again. That's my conclusion. Now, are there questions or comments anyone has? Anybody have any questions or comments? All right. We've gone about 45 minutes roughly. So again, let me point out here, let me go back to one other thing that we'll try to deal with next time, and that's partial pressures. It was here somewhere, but I don't remember where it was. But we'll go back and do some work on partial pressures. You might get on the internet and look up the term partial pressure, and that would PARTIAL, PRESSURE, partial pressure. That will be very helpful. And we'll try to use that just a little bit because the amount of oxygen can go in a gas is dependent upon the pressure, the kind of gas it is, considering the liquid you have. And all we're concerned about is water for our purposes, because your blood is mostly water and the aquatic animals would be in the water. And so what we have here is we're looking at the partial pressure of water. That's all I'm really concerned about. And there's two main gases that are problems for us, and that's oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, nitrogen would be a factor as well, so we need to look at nitrogen as well. But remember, a reduced nitrogen atmosphere changes the way the organisms function. And we've already shown that to be the case. So if we increase the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, we have to reduce the other gases. And the main other gas is nitrogen. Right now it's 78% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, about 1% the rest. If we increase from 21 up to 35%, we went up 14% in the amount of oxygen. So we had to push the nitrogen down by 14%. So it had to go down as that 14% of the total gas. So that had to happen. And so we got all kinds of stuff happening that is different than what it was before the flood. Lots of changes. Now, I'm going to quit unless there are questions. Any questions at all? Let me do this.